Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. The year was 1924, and fur trapper Jess Sethington had decided to make his way up to the headwaters of the Unuk River without the companionship of another person. People venturing into the isolated backcountry of Alaska have an unwritten rule, and that was to never go alone. But Jess didn't heed that advice. He was very experienced, after all, and his trip was not supposed to be long in duration. Jess didn't return when scheduled, and 4 of his woodsman friends began the tracking process. They located several of his campsites, and then all the signs of the trapper disappeared. About 9 years later, gold miners and brothers Jack and Bruce Johnstone and their trusty dog Slasher had decided to trek to the productive headwaters of the Unuk River. The labor of the day was exhausting yet rewarding, as the remote area was largely untapped and begrudgingly yielding its gold in exchange for sweat and blood. As the weary men finished up their dinner around the campfire, they heard a distant noise, a drawn-out noise, unlike anything the experienced outdoorsmen had ever heard. They knew the sounds of every animal in the wild, and this noise was definitely strange to them. Slasher's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl as he stared into the blackness beyond the light of the campfire. Their profiles glimmered in the fireglow as they listened and waited. Suddenly the deep moan was closer and more definite. It haunted the darkness of the woods and made their hair stand on end. The waiting and listening only added to the tension. The men checked the actions of their firearms and added more firewood to the campfire. The noise eventually waned, and the miners retired to salvage what sleep they could for the night. The next year, the brothers made the same treacherous journey and decided to explore an area called Sulphide Creek. In the canyon at the headwaters of the creek, the men observed a giant brown bear on the far side of the creek. Upon seeing the men, the bear made a straight line toward them. Jack immediately emptied his rifle into the charging Bruin, but the bear made it across the raging creek and lifted itself up onto the bank, despite an obviously broken back. Jack then pulled his sidearm and completely emptied the gun into the bear just before it slipped on the bank and tumbled into the raging current to be swept away. Upon returning downstream to their boat, the men found the oars splintered and their boat with a gaping hole in the hull. All of this damage was apparently done by a bear. The Johnstone brothers returned the next year and pitched a temporary camp in a flat area and started setting up their sleeping arrangements. In the middle of the night, Jack was awakened to see a giant dark shape silently approach him while he was in his sleeping bag. He slowly reached for his rifle, but Slasher flashed to their defense. The dog and bear hastily chased each other in the bush, surrounded by a cacophonous eruption of barking, growling, and gravel and bushes snapping. Later in the fall of the same year, the men investigated the river shore near the camp and found it strewn with partially consumed salmon carcasses and bear scat and tracks. The previous night, they were stirred from slumber by the now familiar and eerie groaning noises, which faded as the animal departed the area. The brothers went to examine a discovered quartz deposit near the camp. As they returned to camp, Slasher raced into the bushes immediately, behind where they had just spent a considerable amount of time examining the quartz deposit. They could not see the bear, but heard the growling and saw the bushes thrashing as the bear and Slasher confronted each other. Immediately following the incident, the familiar groaning started up once again, as the bear was persuaded to leave. The brothers had to seriously consider the possibility that the bear had been silently lying in ambush for them to get within striking distance. The next summer, the brothers returned with their friend George and their reliable protector, Slasher. Bruce decided to quickly examine the quartz deposit again and left his rifle in the boat. While pushing his way through the tangled underbrush, Bruce heard a loud snort near the trail. The bear charged, but remained in the dense cover, which was shaking in the footfalls of the giant mankiller. As the bear assessed how to kill the man, but remained protected by the foliage, he started the familiar and drawn-out groaning, so familiar now to the men. Armed only with a .410 pistol for protection, Bruce backed down the trail while alternately firing over the bushes and reloading the firearm. The charging bear stopped his charge temporarily, only to resume the charge with more anger and speed than before. Each time Bruce fired his pistol, the bear would pause its charge, giving him a few seconds to reload and fire again, once the bear continued the pursuit. Each time the man fired over the bushes, the bear would cough and snort, and then moan. This awkward pursuit continued until the pair reached the boat anchored on the shore of the river. The bear always managed to keep enough cover between him and his prey to keep from being shot. Bruce finally dashed across the beach and grabbed his rifle. He spun around ready to dispatch his pursuer, but the bear remained concealed in the brush. For the next 30 minutes, the bear paced and stomped back and forth and groaned. They now knew the bear was trying to ambush them, and was not afraid of an armed man. Later in the fall of that same year, the brothers returned to the area and worked hard to complete a small cabin to shelter themselves. They fell a few cottonwoods and arranged them in a protective yet very preliminary foundation of a cabin. They kept the fire roaring, but the bear returned several times through the night and moaned that sorrowful and tortured regret each time. Slasher would chase him back into the bush, but the bear seemed to grow in boldness in a desperate escalation. The brothers continually held back, using their firearms until they could get a certain kill shot. But the darkness provided the obscurity the bear needed. The last thing they wanted was a wounded and aggressive bear to deal with. The sun finally revealed a safer situation, and the men immediately chugged their coffee and commenced working feverishly on their cabin. After making a satisfactory amount of progress, Bruce decided to stake out their mining claim to ward off competing miners. As he was carving out a stake from a small tree stump, Slasher growled and dashed past him in a blur of fur and teeth. Bruce quickly pivoted and was stunned by the sight of a gigantic, one-eyed bear. Bruce grabbed his rifle and fired from the hip. The bear was mere feet from the end of his rifle barrel, and the bullet found purchase in the bear's massive shoulder. Between the impact of the bullet and the kick of the rifle, the bear and the man were pushed out of the path of one another, and the bear blurred past Bruce. The massive blur of enraged bear piled up just past the man and let out a low and long groan. As the bear regained his feet and turned to charge again, Bruce fired and struck him in the neck. Again, the mankiller collapsed. Incredibly, the bear struggled to its feet again, and this time Bruce placed one of his few remaining bullets just behind the bear's ear, bringing its fury to an end. The bear lay dead at Bruce's feet. Bruce could not believe the size nor the condition of the bear. The deformed mass of the bear was frightening. Bruce observed that the giant bear had thick, leather-like skin with patches of fur, and was deformed in its face. The bear was missing its right eye, which was grown over with scar tissue. Its snout was painfully twisted, with several of its mostly rotten teeth missing and infected. Realizing his lack of ammunition, Bruce called Slasher, and the pair returned to camp. The other two men in the mining camp returned to the carcass to stare in awe and wonder at the massive and deformed mankiller. They hacked its deformed head, as well as its 10-inch wide paws from its carcass, and departed to finish the season with a great amount of peace of mind. Back at camp, Bruce skinned the bear's head, and the culmination of their experiences started to make sense. The bear's right eye socket had at some point prior been shattered by a bullet and healed over. Just above the right eye was another bullet that was in a state of healing as well. A third bullet had grazed the base of the bear's skull. The right jaw socket had been obliterated by at least one bullet, and the bones of the bear's jaw did not meet, nor had they healed. They remained infected and decaying as the bear lived on. Below the bear's jaw rested two .33 caliber bullets, and in the gristle of the jaw he discovered three .38 caliber bullets from a pistol. The disappearance of Jeff Sethington flashed back to Bruce's mind, and he shuddered at the realization of the position the man had to be in to fire the bullets into the bear at that angle. The following year, the men returned to the location of the carcass and examined the bear's remains, now only bones. Bruce found that 4 of the bear's vertebrae had fused together into a single vertebrae just over 8 inches in length. The giant bear's back had been broken, and the 2 adjoining ribs had grown together and fused with each other. Could this be the same bear that charged the brothers from across the creek and was washed downstream in the raging current?
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place on Raspberry Island, which is an island just north of Kodiak Island in Alaska. Raspberry Island is a rolling hill country covered with brush and grass. The streams are filled with salmon seasonally, and the hills with berries. The perfect environment for bears, very large bears. It was a cold, blustery day in November 1999. Gene Moe was hunting deer on Raspberry Island, a very remote and primitive location. Gene knew well that when it snowed, like other areas, deer on Raspberry Island would be pushed to lower elevations to find browse and shelter. The location is a mountainous wilderness filled with hazards and excitement, just the way the 69-year-old liked it. He spent many a season in the backwoods, enjoying solitude and peace. This year was possibly the last time he would enjoy this environment. He was going to make the most of it. After a few days of hunting together, he and his hunting partner Steve decided to split up to cover different areas and mitigate their different perspectives and strategies. Gene told Steve that if he heard a shot to come and assist, just to make sure everything was okay. Even though the hunting partners were only a few hundred yards apart, Gene managed to call in a Sitka blacktail, the predominant deer species of the area. As twilight was creeping in, Gene leaned over his buck and started to process his harvest. He used his 4-inch buck knife to gut the deer and started to remove the hide from the carcass. Gene leaned his rifle up against a tree nearby while he worked. In a chaotic explosion of swaying bushes and growling, an extremely large brown bear emerged from the brush a very short distance away. The Bruin was foaming at the mouth and spitting and growling through razor-sharp yellow teeth. Armed with only his knife, Gene readied himself for a life-or-death confrontation. He knew if he ran, he would trigger the bear's predatory instincts and be overcome from behind, the most vulnerable direction. He stared the hungry bear in the eyes and conveyed a devotion and commitment met by the bear's. The ears of the bear lowered, and its head dropped in the final signal of commitment. The bear surged forward toward Gene. He had no previous experience to fall back on, so he decided to extend the only defensive weapon he had, his skinning knife. He held the blade out straight toward the charging bear and placed his feet far apart to brace for impact. Gene was 6 feet 1 inches tall and in great shape. He worked out regularly for hunting and fishing seasons. You see, Gene was a product of the Great Depression, and those folks did not shrink from hardship nor threat. Years of finishing concrete had honed his physique and resolve. As the giant bear closed the 30 feet that separated the pair, Gene prayed out loud, saying, "Lord, I need your help. Help me, Lord." The bear didn't hesitate as it drew on years of instinct. As the bear blurred toward Gene, the edge of the knife held forward didn't strike the bear's mouth, as Gene had intended, but skimmed along the Bruin's cheek and sliced open a gash along the length of its skull. The now injured and angered bear clamped down on Gene's right arm, around his bicep, tearing the muscle and flesh from just above his elbow all the way down to his wrist. From the pain of the initiation of the attack, Gene thought his arm was completely torn off. The direction and force of the bear's focus caused Gene to turn towards the bear, and he instinctively wrapped his left arm around the neck of the giant predator. Gene tried to poke the bear in the eye. Instead, he managed to get his first finger into its ear and pushed it in as far as he could. The bear reacted with confusion and pulled back. With his arm still around its neck, the bear suplexed Gene like a professional wrestler. Amazed at the ease of which the bear just launched him about 10 feet, Gene sprang back to his feet. The bear, now only about 5 yards away, took a few seconds to review the situation. It stood on its hind legs and walked towards its adversary. Like a wary boxer, Gene watched the bear's right paw, knowing most are like humans and prefer their right side. Gene circled to his left as the bear struck out with its right paw. Even though Gene pulled his head back, one of the bear's claws bisected his left ear. The bear immediately followed up with a quick swipe from its left paw, which landed on Gene's right leg and knocked him to the ground. The claws from the bear tore up his leg and parted skin, muscle, and tendon. As the bear closed in, Gene put his boots together and double-kicked the bear just under the chin, sending it backward, knocking it down. Gene beat the bear back to his feet. By this point in the brawl, Gene had recognized that the death battle had an informally defined arena. The bear circled to Gene's left, and he knew from experience the Bruin would use its left paw to attack. Gene slipped inside of it and was pressed into the bear's chest. The bear twisted its head to catch Gene's right knee and clamped down. Instinctively, Gene tried to gain leverage and wrapped his arm around the bear's neck, but the bear was too strong. Gene swung his blade up to just below the bear's jaw and plunged it in repeatedly. He dug the blade in as far as he could and the bear pulled back in resistance. The bear's right paw wrapped around Gene's left buttock, and he lifted the man off the ground to attempt another pro wrestler-style slam. Without the added power of its right leg, the bear couldn't complete the motion and had to release its grip on the man. As the bear did this, Gene took his blade, and with as much energy as he could muster, he plunged the short blade into the flesh just behind the bear's massive head. This strike hit something hard, and the bear retreated a short distance, with its head cocked to one side and spraying blood all over Gene. Before we bring our frightening story to a conclusion, we want to make sure to invite you to help us in our quest to earn 10,000 subscribers. If you enjoy our channel, please consider subscribing, and please remember to like and share our videos on your social media profiles if you like them. We really appreciate you, and now back to our story. The bear seemed to shrink as it gushed blood. Gene yelled, "Come on, bear, the Lord is on my side." And with that challenge, the 750-pound Bruin leapt the 6-foot distance toward Gene. In a last-ditch effort, Gene swung his left fist with all the fury a man fighting for his life could muster, striking the bear just below the right eye. The bear quivered for a split second and bounced off the ground in a heap. The way the bear collapsed, with its feet and head under its body, Gene knew the bear was dead. With his knife still clasped in his right hand and his left hand still clenched in a fist, Gene knew he would ensure his victory with a resounding blast from his rifle. He had to open his right fist with his teeth and his now numb left hand to grasp his rifle. Pushing the dangling flesh of his right arm back into position, Gene fired 2 shots to ensure the end of the struggle. Gene then realized the first part of his struggle had ended, and he needed to get back to the beach to survive. He pushed his way through the dense alders for about 2 miles as branches pulled at his mutilated right arm. He was exhausted, thirsty, and decided to lay down to die. He prayed to God to take him from his condition. He fell and got back up 3 times before finally reaching the beach. Gene was too far gone to continue and mustered a loud yell to his hunting partners, and they responded. Approaching him, they witnessed his clothes torn to tatters and his body ripped up beyond hope. Gene begged his friends to shoot him and end his misery. The trio rounded up Gene's son and sped toward the nearest radio in 40 miles. Gene's son tore fabric strips into impromptu bandages as the group rendered their best version of first aid. The U.S. Coast Guard was notified and happened to be completing exercises in the area. They immediately flew toward the remote location to help. The doctor at Kodiak's new hospital worked on Gene for 7 hours, sewing up his wounds. A group of Gene's friends and volunteers decided to head up to the attack scene, following Gene's blood trail. They located his rifle and found the dead bear. It was a 13-year-old sow who had chased off her 2 cubs just a short time earlier to fatten up for the winter. She attacked him out of hunger because that year the salmon had not run.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the woods of Alberta, Canada, to a place aptly nicknamed Crying Canyon. It is located on the eastern slope of the Canadian Rockies, and the alpine zone is guarded by granite peaks reaching almost 9,000 feet in elevation. Beneath the granite peaks are thick forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees, growing so close together that they look like a beautiful green carpet when you look across the valley. There seem to be more white-tailed deer here than humans in nearby Calgary, and moose are plentiful too. If you look closely toward the mountaintops, you might see mountain goats as well as Canadian bighorn sheep as they perform their gravity-defying ballet along the cliffs. There are cougars, black bears, and wolves here, but the grizzly bears present the most danger of all. 32-year-old Jeremy Evans was raised in Calgary, which is only a stone's throw away. He was a meat packer and an avid outdoorsman. He had been hunting and fishing nearly all of his life and spent about 2 months of each year in the mountains pursuing his passions. He most enjoyed bow hunting, but this year he hoped to bag a big old ram, and that is best done with a hunting rifle. Jeremy was married to the love of his life, Joyce, and they had recently welcomed their first child into their family. She was his first girlfriend, and he was her first boyfriend. They had been with each other ever since they began dating in high school, and were custom-made for each other. Joyce was a bona fide marine biologist and well-educated. She was a city girl, mostly, and Jeremy, her perfect complement by contrast. Joyce was still on maternity leave, but passed her time while volunteering at a local nonprofit when she wasn't busy taking care of the baby and Jeremy. Jeremy had planned on a dream sheep hunt for this fall and had put the time into researching locations and strategies to be successful. His meticulous planning for his hunts bordered on obsession, but his wife humored and supported him. Jeremy's sheep hunt was coming up soon, and he'd planned a quick scouting trip to find out just how much success awaited him in those dark forests and granite peaks. At 3 a.m. on August 17th of 2017, Jeremy hopped into his pickup truck and pulled out of his driveway. He'd carefully loaded his backpack and all the supplies he would need for what he planned to be a 3-day backcountry scouting trip for a trophy ram. Hiking into where he wanted to go would take an ordinary hunter a few days, so Jeremy sped this process up a bit by riding his mountain bike, which he placed in the bed of his truck. Jeremy knew from prior seasons that day hunters would hit the areas nearest the roads early in the morning, and that pressure would drive the sheep back to where he planned to hunt. He'd planned to set up base camp about 8 miles back up the trail, hoping that the head start on the day hunters would bring him success in his ram hunt. After driving for 3 hours to the trailhead, Jeremy slipped his backpack over his shoulders and pedaled up the hill. The foliage blurred by as an excitement of fulfilling the plans and goals he'd been working on started to take shape. His legs churned like pistons, driving him up and down each slope of the trail. Jeremy was so familiar with this area that he knew where the usuals would camp. He knew about 4 miles into his journey he would pass a sheepherder's tent with an older gentleman sipping coffee out front, but this time the old man was missing. Jeremy energetically zipped past a couple of men, possibly hikers, but maybe hunters, doing some scouting as well. They were on foot and taken aback a bit by seeing someone riding a mountain bike in this area. They stared at him as he passed, but he simply focused on finding the turn in the trail leading him to the more remote part of the canyon. This part of the canyon is so steep and rugged that few people make it back here. That is part of what drew Jeremy to this location. The ruggedness and solitude were exactly what he wanted. He brought along his binoculars in his backpack, as well as his bear spray and high-powered hunting rifle. He carefully navigated the crumbling slopes of a few drainages and emerged to the open face of the mountain. The trees stopped suddenly, creating a panoramic view of the hillside. Jeremy picked his way slowly around the hill, glassing for sheep as he went. It wasn't long before his hard work paid off as a small herd of sheep appeared on the hillside opposite of him. Jeremy leaned up on his handlebars and used them as a steady rest to get a good look at the herd. He watched for several minutes, examining each individual and searching the males for that full curl set of horns so desired by a sheep hunter. As he adjusted his position a bit, he saw a small brown blur run across the trail just in front of him. He was far too experienced to wonder what it was, and instantly knew it was a grizzly cub. The most foreboding part was that where there is a grizzly cub, there is always a very protective and angry grizzly mama nearby. Fearful and profane words briefly flashed through his mind. He knew he was danger close to this cub, and that what came next could be disastrous for him. He knew if he was lucky, he may be able to get to his bear spray, still stowed in his backpack, now leaning on his mountain bike. As Jeremy bent down and opened the flap to his backpack, a few things he neglected to do flashed through his mind. He now regretted not loading his firearm and leaving his bear spray at the bottom of his pack, instead of clipping it to his hip. Experience told him that missing these details is bad, but usually not crucial. His experience today would reveal just how crucial every little detail is when you're confronted by a grizzly bear. Before he could get his hand around the handle of his bear spray bottle, an ominous crack of a twig snapping just behind his right shoulder provided a clue to the question that plagued him. As he turned his head, he could see the sow grizzly in midair, her left paw outstretched toward him. The whites of her eyes conveyed rage, and her wide-open mouth clearly presented her violent intentions. Jeremy reacted lightning fast by grabbing his bike frame and positioning it between himself and the sow. As a hunter myself, I've played the mental gymnastics of the what-if game. If a bear surprised me, I would hold my bow out like a shield while stabbing with my arrows like giant daggers. It is kind of like the famous quote of Mike Tyson's, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face." Jeremy's plan actually seemed to work a bit. The sow's head went right through the frame of his bike, and her claws got stuck in the spokes of his wheels. As she struggled to remove herself from his bike, Jeremy held his backpack between them. I'm sure that he hoped that the confusion wrought by getting tangled up in the bike would cause the sow to retreat and reconsider her attack plan, but he could tell by the way she looked at him that that was not going to happen. With the bike frame wrapped around her neck, she again charged toward him. It was all he had at the time, so Jeremy used his backpack to crack the grizzly over the head several times. He used it as a shield to push her jaws away from him, time and time again. She was rapacious and determined to get to him, though. The protective sow somehow got the frame of Jeremy's backpack into her mouth, and the two had a very mismatched and brief episode of tug-of-war. Each time, Jeremy managed to somehow keep hold of his backpack. She bit through his hands and his backpack frame, while he fought her off for a few minutes. The sow then took a few steps back and shook off the bike frame. She turned away from Jeremy, appearing to go find her cub. As she backed up, Jeremy also backed up, all the while scrambling through his backpack, trying to get to his rifle. For no apparent reason, the sow spun on her heels. She came charging back toward Jeremy with renewed fervor. Jeremy hadn't yet got control of his rifle, so he threw his backpack at the sow. Thinking it better if he fled up the slope, then used the height to leap into a tree for escape, Jeremy sprinted as fast as he could. His jump into a spruce tree only granted him about 7 feet of separation from a sow grizzly probably nearly that high on her hind legs. As he pulled himself up into the tree, he felt the claws of the sow wrap around his right leg just before he could lift it out of her range. As she pulled his right leg toward her mouth, Jeremy powerlessly watched as her mouth opened wide and she plunged her huge canines into the flesh behind his knee. He braced to feel the flood of pain race through his body, but felt nothing. The sow jerked Jeremy out of the spruce tree and slammed him onto the ground at its base. He crawled under the spruce tree boughs to try to hide and wrapped himself around its trunk. His strategy worked, until it didn't. The sow was clawing at Jeremy while he clung to the spruce trunk, but could not get a good hold of him, at least not a good enough one to pull him out from under the tree. Jeremy was sheltered partially by the branches of the spruce tree, but she managed to push her head close enough to him to bite into the flesh of his left side. She jerked him out with such force that he could not stay wrapped around the base of the spruce and flew about 6 feet through the air. Now at this time, Jeremy weighed 250 pounds and was not a fat 250. He was strong and fit, and this sow not only broke the grip of his body curled around the spruce trunk, but also threw him a distance of 6 feet. Let that sink in for just a moment. As quickly as Jeremy impacted the ground, the angry sow was standing over the top of him. He lay curled into a ball on his right side, trying to protect his vital organs, head and neck, all at once. He tried to resist her as she pushed her open mouth around part of his face, but her power and speed were overwhelming. One of her upper canines punched its way through the inside corner of Jeremy's left eye socket, completely crushing his nose as it tore its path. At the same time, her other upper canine pierced Jeremy's flesh of the outside of his left eye. As she closed her jaws, the bones of Jeremy's face crunched and popped as she pulled the flesh away from the bone. Having his face torn from his skull, Jeremy decided that playing dead or non-threatening wasn't working. He rolled over onto his back and started throwing blows with the sow. He poked his fingers into her eyes, pulled her ears, and jabbed his fingers up into her nose. He was trying anything he could to get her to back off. His desperate strategies weren't enough to deter the sow, as she shook her head to break his grip and opened her mouth wide toward his face once again. As quick as he could, Jeremy plunged his left fist into her mouth and slid it past her leathery, scarred tongue. He opened his fist and grabbed her tongue as hard as he could. The sow immediately started gagging and choking. She turned toward Jeremy's left and pawed him with her hind paws while trying to get his fist from her mouth. As Jeremy grasped the bear's tongue with his left hand, he attempted to push her off of him with his right. His hand slipped along her fur to an area with thinner fur covering it, and he knew it to be her lower abdomen. He felt around and grabbed onto what he thought must be testicles and squeezed as hard as he could. This sow let out a sound reminiscent of a pig's squeal. It was high-pitched, painful, and had an element of surprise to it. The sow bucked and twisted, trying to get away from Jeremy's grip on such sensitive parts. After he released his grip, the sow ran into the bush and disappeared. Jeremy regained his feet and stumbled to his backpack. He knew he was in big trouble with such debilitating wounds. From his backpack he pulled his cell phone and immediately clicked a few photos of the damage the sow had done to his face. He grew concerned that he could see very large portions of his face missing, misaligned, or disfigured. His face was tattered and torn. Parts of his flesh dangled from unknown previous positions. He pulled his backpack close to him and gripped his rifle. Jeremy was so adrenalized that he even thought he could continue looking for sheep, but it wasn't long before it wore off and the pain set in. He began assessing his other injuries and noted that his right leg would not work properly. His tendons that operated his joints had been severed in several key places. On his left side, he was missing a bare-mouth-sized piece of flesh, and the same on his inner thigh. As he loaded his rifle, due to his injuries, he placed the butt of the stock on the ground with the barrel across his left shoulder as he placed rounds in the gun's clip with his right hand. Suddenly his hands went limp, and he heard and felt crunching. The sow had returned from behind Jeremy as he was distracted, loading his rifle. She'd crept up on him and bit onto the width of the back of his skull and crushed it. Jeremy could hear loud pops and crunches as his skull gave way to the enormous force of the sow's canines and jaws. Jeremy could see the scenery shifting as the sow worked to pull him up the hill. He was in a seated position and leaned against her front paws as she rested for a moment. The sow then reached up with her right paw and dug her claws into Jeremy's face, at his nose, and at the corner of his mouth. She peeled the skin of his cheek away, up to his right eyeball, and severed his ear completely. As she tore at his flesh with her claws, she continually bit at his face and skull, cracking and breaking bones. Jeremy stared into her mouth as she pulled chunks of flesh from his face. He started to feel a sense of peace come over him. He knew he couldn't live through all of this damage. As soon as he began to give in to death and accept his fate, the sow changed positions and dropped him onto his back. Whatever part of Jeremy's body that the bite to the back of his head caused to go out of whack, being dropped onto his back put it back in place. Feeling returned to his arms and hands. He could move them again. His vision was filled with something dark and blurry. He didn't know it at this time, but both of his eyes had been dislocated during this portion of the attack. Jeremy's head was now near the sow's abdomen, and her head was toward his feet. In one last burst of fight, Jeremy again grasped onto the portion of the bear's anatomy that he thought was testicles and began trying to tear them off. As he did this, he wrapped his legs around the neck of the sow. This inflicted obvious and tremendous pain on the bear, and she began bucking like a bronco, trying to separate Jeremy from her. The sow was in so much pain that she vomited and defecated, while she rolled on the ground, trying to shake herself from Jeremy's grasp. She was squealing like a pig and dragging him through the grass while trying to rub him off of her. At this point, Jeremy once again let go of the sow's sensitive anatomy and watched as she squealed and barked her way down the mountain in the opposite direction. Hoping that this time the sow would stay gone, but nearly completely blinded, Jeremy searched around with his hands, trying to locate his rifle. He knew she had dragged him uphill from his rifle and backpack a ways, so he crawled down to where he found the trail. Then he felt around and located his backpack, and finally his rifle. He was frantic and terrified the sow would return, and felt around to find his clip. His vision was so blurry that he couldn't tell what he was looking at, but spotted a dark linear object on the ground. He bent over to pick up what he thought was his clip, but turned out to be his severed mustache and goatee. Close to that, he picked up a piece of his ear and other parts of his scalp. Then he found the clip to his rifle. He shoved the clip into his rifle and fired 3 quick shots at a large dark mystery object nearby, just in case it was the sow. Jeremy was desperate, and certain there was no way he was going to live through this last part of the attack. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and began to type a message to his wife. He knew he had no cell service, but thought of it as a type of message in a bottle that she may be able to receive someday after his death. Jeremy knew he had about 14 miles of rugged and difficult country to cross just to get back to his truck. As he tried to stand, his right leg gave out. The portion of flesh the sow had torn from his leg rendered it useless. He looked down to see the hole the bear had torn in his side, open and bleeding. He had a moment of confusion and conflict. He wasn't sure if he should fight the inevitable any longer. There was simply no way he could make it out of this alive. He placed the butt of his rifle against the ground and tried to end his own suffering, but his rifle wouldn't fire. Amazingly, once the barrel cleared his head, it went off with a thunderous clap, like a giant judge rendering a verdict. He decided to take that as a sign that he needed to try to get out. Jeremy decided that if he made it easier to locate his body after his death, that would be an achievable goal. He aimed to make it as close to the trailhead as possible. Before he started to crawl, he took the severed pieces of his flesh he had picked up and placed them flesh-side down on the wounds of his face and skull. He then wrapped his entire head in a sweater to hold the pieces in place. He used the arms of the sweater to reposition his jaw, which was hanging from his face. Determined to make it closer to his truck somehow, Jeremy staggered to his feet, but his right leg buckled, and he collapsed. This process happened over and over as Jeremy continually tried to walk down the steep trail. At one point in the journey, Jeremy lost his footing and tumbled several hundred feet down the trail, landing on a small group of boulders. He had come to a stop in the creek at the bottom of the drainage. He was exhausted and in excruciating pain. Jeremy had decided that he would give up and wait to die in his sleep. Jeremy pulled his cell phone from his pocket and tapped on the screen. It looked like a cloudy jumble of images and letters. He just wanted to listen to some music as he drifted off to sleep and randomly clicked on a song on his playlist. When his little daughter was sick or scared, Jeremy would play the song Baby Shark for her on his phone.
He'd saved it there, so he could do just that, and now he drew inspiration to continue to fight for his life from this song he shared with his daughter so often. Jeremy crawled to the top of the drainage and tumbled down the other side. He picked himself back up at the bottom and crawled up the far side of the next drainage as well, all while the song Baby Shark was stuck on repeat. He mostly crawled, but managed to stumble several miles out to the trail junction, driven by the memories he'd had of his 6-month-old baby girl. About 7 miles into his escape, Jeremy approached the sheepherder's tent. He hoped that the 2 gentlemen he had passed earlier today on his mountain bike would be there. Jeremy's left eye dangled onto his cheek, and in order to see out of it, he had to tip his head back very far. He glanced about, hoping that someone would come to investigate the noise he made, but there was nobody there. He broke down and cried at the realization. Just past the sheepherder's tent, Jeremy had to stumble down another slope. He tumbled over 10 feet and landed in the creek, completely submerged. Undaunted, he crawled out of the creek like a zombie, still focused on his mission to survive and see his wife and daughter one more time. He crawled and stumbled down the trail to what he'd hoped to be his next chance of finding help. He staggered to the outfitter's tents pitched along the trail and searched everywhere for anyone to help him, but nobody was at this camp either. He couldn't believe no one was there and trashed the place looking for some kind of means of communications, a beacon or a satellite phone. Jeremy found a locked cabinet and thought it had to have something valuable in it. When he tried to pry off the lock, his hands wouldn't work, so he pulled it from the wall and smashed it on the floor. Once opened, he could see it contained only canned foods and a pocket knife and a case that resembled a cell phone. Every time he crossed another waypoint, it seemed his journey got longer and more difficult. By this point, Jeremy had several bare-mouth-sized bites removed from various parts of his body, most of the flesh slashed away from his face, as well as his skull crushed from both the front and back sides. He'd walked right around 11 miles from the initial attack site and fallen down the downhill portions of almost every hill he'd crossed doing so. He'd managed to stumble his way toward camps he expected to be occupied by people, only to have his hopes dashed each time he arrived. He was too tired to continue. Whether it was exhaustion, hopelessness, or just getting ready to die, Jeremy found a sleeping bag and rolled it out next to a wood stove at the camp. Before he lay down, he decided he would write a letter to the camp owners. He sat down at the table with paper and pen, but as he leaned over the table, his blood dripped onto the paper. Seeing some paper towels and toilet paper nearby, he took them in his hands and wrapped his entire head in the absorbent sheets. Somehow he found some athletic tape used to bandage sprained ankles of hunters and hikers, and wrapped that around his head as well. He then reached up to his dislocated and gashed jaw, which had hung from his face toward the left side of his body to this point. Jeremy pushed a few severed folds of skin back in place and pressed his jaw back into its socket. It clicked back into place, and he was overjoyed to be able to speak again. He finished off wrapping his entire head with the toilet paper, paper towels, and tape, and continued his note writing. A picture of exactly what Jeremy wrote and photos of his injuries would not pass YouTube standards, so I've posted them on my Patreon account linked below. I will urge you not to look at these pictures if you are sensitive or squeamish. They're actually some of the worst I've ever seen. Jeremy's deformed and damaged beyond human recognition, and you view them at your own discretion. While Jeremy penned his letter, he squirted juice from juice boxes into his mouth. This restored his energy, and he felt like he could make the 5 miles remaining to his truck. He had 5 remaining juice boxes, and that would be just enough for 1 for each mile. As Jeremy dragged his stiffened right leg for 4 more miles, he came upon a set of twin boulders and knew he was nearly back to his vehicle. He squished the contents of the last juice box into his mouth and kissed his hands before placing one on each of the twin boulders. He knew he would now make it back to his truck. The last mile was probably the easiest for Jeremy to navigate, given it was the least technical and most hopeful. As soon as he slid into the driver's seat, the first thing he did was rip the rearview mirror from the windshield. The last thing he wanted to see was what happened to him now. He was afraid it might dishearten him, so it just wasn't the time for it. That would come, but later in his journey. Although his vision was good enough for Jeremy to find his way back from Crying Canyon, it was nowhere near good enough for him to safely drive. Nothing was in focus, and everything lacked detail. He simply aimed his truck for the spot with the most light and figured the forest would be the darker areas, so he avoided driving into them. For over 12 miles of winding and treacherous gravel mountain road, Jeremy drove, his hopes and optimism welling up as he got closer and closer to rescue. It had been about 8 hours since Jeremy had been attacked by the sow grizzly. He pulled into the remote family-run outfitting company at the Panther River Resort. As he parked his truck and stepped out, resembling something like a low-budget movie zombie, he could see a child's face disappear from the big window in the front of the building. He stumbled over to the door and heard a child say, "Grandma, someone's trying to prank us." The little face he had seen disappear from the window had apparently spent a few seconds in some kind of panic in reaction to Jeremy's appearance, and had decided it was all a joke of some sort. Jeremy immediately explained how he'd been mauled by a bear, and this was no prank. He quickly passed the boy's grandparents his wallet and cell phone, and requested they call his wife and tell her. Jeremy's wife, Joyce, was helping out at a non-profit when her cell phone rang. She was driving, so she ignored it at first. But as it rang, she could see it was coming from an unlisted number. This is frequently how the police call people, so she picked up the call to see what was going on. As their relationship entered previously uncharted waters, Jeremy and Joyce searched for what was their next step. She was wrought with confusion and worry, while he was asking for a glass of room-temperature water with a straw to relieve his thirst. At the Panther River Resort, the family of caretakers did exactly that. They took care of Jeremy by calling for the Shock Trauma Air Rescue Service. STARS, as it's called, is a Canadian nonprofit helicopter air ambulance service operating out of Calgary who transports critically ill or injured people to care. The resort had a planned wedding ceremony at their site scheduled for that day, so the owner helped Jeremy get back into his truck and drive around the backside of the building as they waited for the air ambulance. Jeremy couldn't help but notice that the 18-year-old girl who was helping take care of him would banter with him but never look him in the face. His wounds were overwhelming to her, and he could see it in her behavior toward him. After being told that the STARS service wouldn't be able to respond to Jeremy's predicament within a predictable time frame, the owner of the ranch decided to fly Jeremy to the hospital in his own helicopter. Jeremy tried to get his fishing rod from the back of his truck to try and catch some bull trout while waiting for the rescue to be organized, but was convinced to sit down and rest instead. The young woman rode with Jeremy in her dad's helicopter as he flew them to Sundre and the medical support team waiting there. The entire flight, the young woman continually poked Jeremy in the side to keep him from passing out, while holding a tarp to catch the blood seeping from his wounds. As soon as the helicopter landed, Jeremy could see several blurry shapes of people waiting to help him. When Jeremy said hi to them, they immediately began shuffling and preparing to take care of him. His right leg was now even more stiff than it had been up to this point, and it was propped over a seat in order to fit him into the helicopter. They struggled to remove his large frame from such a tight fit, but Jeremy slowly walked off the helicopter under his own power. Jeremy was loaded into the ambulance and endured another 90-minute ride to a more supportive Calgary hospital. As they drove, one of the doctors had to hold Jeremy's head up and off of the gurney. The crushed portion of his skull was too fragile to bear the bumps and jostling of the drive otherwise. En route, they tried to intubate Jeremy, but weren't sure how to do it, given he was missing his nose and a good portion of his mouth. He was breathing through wound channels torn open between his eyes, and once he was laid flat, he couldn't see anything. Before allowing the medical team to put him under sedation, Jeremy insisted he be allowed to tell his mother and wife goodbye, as he was afraid he might not wake up. He had a nurse place a towel over his head to hide his wounds as he spoke with Joyce. She could see one of his green eyes misplaced, and wondered if he would survive. Once he was wheeled away, the medical team completed some x-rays to understand the destruction to his skull and facial bone. They also completed a CAT scan to assess the bleeding on his brain. They blocked his head in place and repositioned his eye to allow him to see better. One of the doctors leaned over Jeremy, and he could see she had green eyes like his. He asked her to hold his hand, and she gladly comforted him. Just before being put under sedation, Jeremy heard a man with an Australian accent reassure him by telling him, "I'm down here at your feet. I got you, buddy," as he rubbed Jeremy's feet to reassure him. Jeremy remembered many details of the procedure. He said he remembered them placing the breathing tube down his throat, and was aware as the initial crews stitched up his wounds in his hands and leg. As the surgeons marveled at how tough Jeremy was, they were even more amazed to find out he had done exactly what needed to be done to preserve the tissues torn from his body during the bear attack. The act of placing the severed tissues into the open wounds actually preserved their viability and allowed them to be reattached to his face. The initial surgery lasted 13 hours, but that would not be the only surgery he would have to endure. Jeremy was placed into a medically induced coma for the day to keep him stationary and rest while he healed. The next day Jeremy awoke, but couldn't see anything. He could hardly hear anything. Swelling had made his head feel like a balloon, and undoubtedly concerned his wife and friends who visited him. In some ways, sleep was worse than being awake. Each time he drifted off to sleep, he was terrified back to consciousness by a dream about the attack. It seemed like the trauma from that confrontation would never end. Jeremy was suffering from PTSD from the attack immediately. Each time he would wake up, the hospital staff would try to restrain him, which reinforced the flashback. He imagined it was the bear pinning him down all over again. The medical staff had Jeremy up and walking very soon. They knew he had to move his body to keep his blood circulating and joints articulating, or he might develop complications. Jeremy passed the time by writing Joyce love letters whenever she was absent from his side. When friends visited Jeremy in the hospital, the staff would help him go outside for walks. Each time he saw a bush or a spruce tree or any darker shape, he froze and refused to go near it. He remained in the hospital for 5 weeks, 8 hours, and 23 minutes. And yes, Jeremy kept track of the time. During his stay there, the staff worked on helping him regain basic function in his legs and arm and deal with the mental trauma of the attack. It would probably be no surprise to anyone hearing this story, but Jeremy returned to the scene of his attack 2 days after being released from the hospital. He took Joyce hunting with him. They bagged a couple of birds while out and visited the lodge staff to let them know he was okay. Within a week of being released from the hospital, he went deer hunting with one of his buddies. They ended up bagging a white-tailed doe and a bull elk. Returning to his normal habits and passions was therapeutic for Jeremy, and his wife and friends became his informal therapists and support staff. Joyce laid down some pretty restrictive ground rules for him, though, as a condition of letting him go back into the woods. She said he had to bring a satellite phone with him that would allow him to send texts from anywhere in the world. It was a very moderate and slight concession on her part, but was important to help Jeremy recover. Jeremy went back to work at the beef slaughterhouse 7 weeks after the mauling. He would have flashbacks while at work. One day his sense of smell suddenly returned, and the scent of blood sent him reeling. His psychiatrist recommended he try rapid acceleration treatment, and after a single 45-minute session, he was able to sleep for an entire night for the first time in a long time. Jeremy has continued to push the boundaries on his healing and confronting his fears resulting from the attack by returning to his attack scene every once in a while. Joyce says that the biggest takeaway from this experience is that life is fragile and precious. Jeremy and Joyce now have a greater value for their family and time together, growing closer with each other. Their story together is recounted in a book titled Mauled, Lessons Learned from a Grizzly Bear Attack, and is linked below for your review. On the cover is a picture of Jeremy after his face was reconstructed. The book discussed different aspects of his attacks in much more detail than presented in this episode. If you would like to show support for Jeremy by purchasing his book, I'm sure he would appreciate it. Wow, if you described this story secondhand to me, I wouldn't believe a single word of it. But this story's true, and straight from Jeremy's own account. If any of you are from Calgary and see Jeremy in town, make sure to buy him a beer or two. After reading the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the sow continually returned to attack Jeremy because she could not find her little cub? Would you have been able to grab onto the bear tongue while squeezing sensitive areas of her anatomy to survive? I honestly don't think it would have crossed my mind. How strong do you think a person has to be to have their head and face crushed, but still manage to make it to help? Will you play the song Baby Shark next time you need motivation? Do you think the sow grizzly that attacked Jeremy had PTSD from getting her sensitive bits squeezed so hard? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.